I bet you have no idea how much car manufacturers and even hot rodders were involved in aircraft. Well, in this video, I'm going to walk you through an air museum and talk about some amazing history. I am a hardcore car guy. I'm not really an airplane guy. The way I feel about them is that they're cool and I love the history, but I really have no idea what I'm talking about. I liken it to people who claim that they're car people, but they really just like to look at them and don't really get it. That's where I am for aircraft. However, in 2022, I went to the Pima Air and Space Museum near Tucson, Arizona, and the place is fantastic. It is an absolute must-see. Go to pimaair.org and you can learn more about it. But I needed to learn more about it. And so what I did is walked through the place, and I didn't even make it halfway through, and I looked for the things that I thought had an automotive connection. And when I came home and researched it, I found out that sure enough, there are so many connections to automotive and hot rodding, and it's all sort of tangled together. You'll start to see all of these car manufacturers working together to make aircraft, and hot rodders stepping in, and some amazing engineering. And I'm not going to tell you the complete history of any of this stuff. I'm just going to give you the highlights of things that most interested me. And the best part about it is that you could go back to that museum and do this same thing again and again and again. And I hope I influence you to go to an aircraft museum and look at the stuff a little bit more critically about how it ties into hot rodding. Before I get into it, I have to remind my regular followers that I am having the Duct Tape Drags event in 2025. It's October 17th and 18th. I am partnering again with Derek from Vice Grip Garage. We'll have the Vice Grip Garage Burnout Pit. We'll have the Battle of the Beaters drag race for low buck cars, but any car that passes NHRA Tech can come play and race, and we'll have the bonfires. It's a party. You need to be there. Check out DuctTapeDrags.com. I will link that and the source directly for tickets and entries right in my description. And now let's get into it, looking at the most directly automotive engine that I saw in the entire place. This is a Boeing Hummingbird. And in the early 2000s, the early versions of this aircraft were powered by turbocharged Subaru Boxer engines. So you'll breathe a sigh of relief when you learn that the Hummingbird was an unmanned vehicle. It's a drone. I feel I have to include this Vietnam-era Bell Huey gunship because the shark teeth originated on the World War II P-40s, the Flying Tigers, and they have influenced so many hot rod and especially rat rod paint jobs. Now we'll get into one of my favorite stories in this whole thing, and it's all about the Allison 1710 V12 engine. Wow, this is good. Here is the museum's Allison V12. It's 1,710 cubic inches, and it made 1,000 to 3,000 horsepower, depending on the combination of centrifugal supercharging and turbocharging and the stage of development. It powered some of our most well-known fighter planes in World War II, including the P-38 and the P-51 Mustang, at least the early ones. And the Allison was very important to hot rodding and also has roots in automotive. The Allison Engineering Company was founded in part by James Allison and Carl Fisher. These two owned Prestolite as well, going back to 1904. And as a tip, you need to listen to the Brian Lowndes Dorkomotive podcast that covers Prestolite. It's a wild story that includes lots of explosions. Allison and Fisher were also car racers and largely responsible for the creation of the Indianapolis Speedway and the Indy 500. Carl Fisher also spearheaded the Lincoln Highway, which was the first cross-country paved road, as well as the Dixie Highway. So you can see these guys are entrenched. Allison and Fisher also ran a company called Indianapolis Speedway Team Company, founded in 1915, and that became the Allison Experimental Company and then Allison Engineering in 1920. One of the things those Allison companies did was modify the Liberty V12 aircraft engines. One of those is seen here with Hap Arnold, an aviation pioneer who became a 5-star general and a chief of the Army Air Corps and later the U.S. Air Force. Look up Hap Arnold, actually an incredible guy. Back to James Allison. When he died in 1928, the company was briefly run by Eddie Rickenbacker, who was a racer himself in the Indy 500 and a whole lot of other stuff. And then the company was quickly bought by Carl Fisher, who had been the co-founder of it. Now, Fisher ended up selling it to General Motors. And ultimately, General Motors split it up and they had the Allison Transmission Company that you probably know of. In 1995, GM sold the engine part of the deal to Rolls-Royce, which is interesting because in World War II, the Allison V12 was most often compared to the Rolls-Royce built Merlin V12. All right, let's get back to the roots of the Allison engine. This engine was the only water-cooled American aircraft power plant in World War II. And they made 70,000 of them, all right here in Indiana. The Allison powered all of the well-known fighter planes of World War II, including the P-38 and the early P-51 Mustang. After World War II, Allison 1710s were sold as surplus for pennies on the dollar, and it didn't take hot rodders long to figure them out. In drag racing, Art and Walt Arfon stunned with several Allison-powered green monster cars, and they were among the growing legion of builders who led NHRA to ban aircraft engines after the 1958 NHRA Nationals. Jim Little's 34 Ford was claimed to be the world's most powerful stock-bodied car, obviously powered by an Allison, and later he made a fiberglass version that was the inspiration for flopper funny cars, and that car was called the world's most powerful or world's quickest sedan. He later built the Quad Al with 4 Allison V12s, although that car never actually ran, but it looked like an amazing freak show. Little also had some other Allison-powered freaks as well. E.J. Potter, who was known as the Michigan Madman for his V8 motorcycles, built an Allison-powered 57 Plymouth called the Nightmare 1. He also had a Dodge Dart wagon called Nightmare 2, again with Allison power. His double ugly pulling tractor had 2 V12s using a common crankcase. So it was 24 cylinders and 3,420 cubic inches. Allison's V12s actually went on to have their longest automotive success in tractor pulling. In land speed racing, one of the most famous Allison-powered cars was Art Arfon's Anteater Streamline that ran more than 300 miles an hour in 1961. The Allison was also used in boat racing. This is Rudy Ramos of Racing Craft at the Salton Sea 500. And this is the boat called Slow Mo Shun, a front-engine hydro that set the record at 178 miles an hour in 1952, obviously with Allison power. And those are just the highlights of the amazing Allison 1710. Next, here's the Wright R2600, or the Cyclone 14, or the Twin Cyclone engine. This was 2 7-cylinder radial engines back to back. It would have been the engine for a B-25 bomber, among others. And yes, its fuel delivery is handled by a name familiar to car people, Holley. Yeah, Holley made carburetors since the early 1900s, in addition to cars and motorcycles and a bunch of other stuff. And they started in aircraft carburetors in the mid-20s. This engine uses a Holley 1685 HA carb. And I'm only guessing here, but I bet you HA is high altitude. It's a pressure carburetor. Interestingly, the footprint for these is the same as a Holley Dominator that would not come until 1969. And now, here's another connection to Holley with a Manasco engine that started in 1926. This is a Buccaneer 6-cylinder, and they also made a 4-cylinder, which was known as the Pirate. The company became known for aircraft racing engines, but later mostly manufactured landing gear. In 1977, Colt bought Manasco. Colt had also purchased Holley in 1968 and sold it in 1998. Then, the Colt company was known as Coltec, and it was purchased by Goodrich Corporation, which had its roots with B.F. Goodrich tires. Look at the 7 degrees of separation. You can do this all day long with planes and cars, and the Pima Museum does have some 4-wheeled vehicles, like this Oshkosh fire truck. Also, here's a cool display talking about belly tanks and their use in land speed racing. Here's this tiny Lakester that's called Claustrophobia. It ran in the 60s with a one-cylinder motorcycle engine, and the driver got in it head first. See, drop tanks, wing tanks, or belly tanks were used to hold extra fuel under a plane for longer missions. Apparently, this crewman figured out how to make a car out of one during World War II. But Bill Burke of Southern California is credited with having made the first dry lakes race car out of a belly tank, choosing it for its aerodynamic shape. Soon, the P-38 type tank became common as a race car because they were aerodynamic and they were much cheaper than a hand-formed race car body because they were available as surplus. A number of belly tanks still race at El Mirage Dry Lake and the Bonneville Salt Flats. Next up, some good stories about the SR-71 spy plane, the Blackbird that a lot of people know about. But did you know this? The SR-71 came from the 60s but was retired in 1989 before a return and a second retirement in 1998. These things were made of titanium and flew at Mach 3. They were really hot rods in and of themselves, built secretly by the Lockheed Skunk Works. But they have a couple of things that are more directly related to maybe your own car. First, here's the start cart. It's used to spin the turbojet engines up to at least 3,200 RPM before they're ignited. At first, Lockheed used two Buick 401 nail heads inside the carts, and later, like this one here, they had two LS7 big block Chevys. Eventually, the V8s were replaced by a compressed air starting system, and that was a lot more boring. Next, I dig the tires on the Blackbird. The sign at the museum describes that the tires are embedded with aluminum to withstand higher heat, and they run 415 psi loaded with nitrogen. The even cooler part is that the tires are made by BF Goodrich, and they carry the old school Silvertown logo. As a complete sidetrack, I spent an hour trying to figure out why the tires are called Silvertown. Here's the quick version. A guy named Palmer invented corded tires for bikes in the 1890s, and they were manufactured by a company in London in an area called Silvertown after its founder, Stephen Silver. Diamond Tire bought the patents for those corded tires, and then around 1911 or 1912, BFG bought Diamond Tire and acquired those patents. And at least by 1912, the tire was named for that area of London where that India Rubber Company was. And then in 1933, BFG also bought that company, bringing the whole thing full circle. And so that's why the Silvertown is called Silvertown, for an area in London that is named after a rubber manufacturer. Now let's get back on track with some things that the Detroit OE car manufacturers did to support aviation in World War II. Now, I know all of these companies converted to wartime manufacturing. They made trucks and trailers and munitions and go on down the list, all kinds of stuff, but we're just going to hit some highlights of what went on in aviation. Here's one I didn't know. This is a plane built by General Motors. It's called the Avenger. It was designed by Grumman Aircraft, and it's said that 3/4 of them were built by GM from World War II into the 60s. Grumman was too busy building the F6F Hellcats, which is the aircraft where Dodge got the name for the modern supercharged Gen 3 Hemis. In 1942, GM opened a new division just to build these planes. It was called Eastern Aircraft, and it had plants in New Jersey, New York, and Maryland. And the same story is true with General Motors for this plane, the Wildcat. Here comes another GM story. This plane is a bomber called the B-24 Liberator. The engines for it are Pratt & Whitney 1,830 cubic inch 14-cylinder radials. And from what I can tell, about 40% of them were made by Buick. Chevrolet made some as well. This is Harlow Curtis, president of Buick at the time, and he's standing with the 25,000th R1830 that was produced by Buick. There were more than 170,000 of these engines built overall during the war. And look at all of these being inspected at the Buick plant. Wow. Buick also made the cylinder blocks for the Packard-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin V12. See how it all comes together with all these different manufacturers? And now, the R2800, an 18-cylinder engine called the Double Wasp. This one made 2,000 to 2,400 horsepower during the war, and it powered airplanes with great names like Corsair, Thunderbolt, Hellcat, Savage, Marauder, Commando, Seawolf, and Harpoon. Man, I just love the names of some aircraft. Taking it back to the automotive stuff, the Double Wasp was built not just by Pratt & Whitney, who developed it, but also by Ford, Chevrolet, and Nash Kelvinator. Now going to Kaiser Frazer Manufacturing, we have the Wright R1300 Cyclone, a 7-cylinder. This was designed during World War II, but not used until the later 40s. A different version of this engine is used in Sikorsky helicopters. At this point, I feel obligated to mention Ford because it really hasn't come up too much. I'm sure the Pima Air and Space Museum has Ford-related stuff that I could have gotten to, but I just didn't make it that far. I bet they even have a Ford-related Jeep. You know, I'm not going to go into the aircraft full history with Ford dating back to the Tri-Motors. I'm just going to talk about a couple of things that really interest me, including the fact that Lincoln, as in Lincoln Motor Car Company, Lincoln Continental, those cars would not even exist if it weren't for aircraft. At the bequest of the government in World War I, Jesse Vincent from Packard and Elbert Hall, who was part of the then prestigious Hall-Scott Motor Company, those two guys were called to design an engine, which they did in 5 days in 1917. These were modular overhead cam units that could have had 4, 6, 8, or 12 cylinders, though the V12 with 1,649 cubic inches had by far the highest production. Now here's the interesting part. General Motors initially declined to produce the military engine for the government, but then stepped in Henry Leland. He had founded Cadillac, but when he saw this deal with the Liberty engines, he quit Cadillac and started Lincoln Motor Company to manufacture the Liberty engines. Many other car manufacturers did this as well, including eventually GM's Cadillac and Buick. But then, in 1922, Leland sold Lincoln to Ford. How cool is that? The other big Ford aviation story is the development of the Willow Run manufacturing compound that was built just for World War II aircraft assembly. It was claimed to be the largest plane manufacturing place in the world, and it was famous for cranking out an absurd number of B-24 bombers, many of them with engines built by Buick and Chevrolet. Willow Run was famously said to complete a bomber every hour during the war. Now, go search an old film on YouTube called Story of Willow Run. It is amazing. Now I should mention Chrysler as well, because it made a bunch of contributions to the war, most centering around the B-29 Superfortress. Chrysler Corporation ended up building more than half of the Wright 18-cylinder 3,550 cubic inch engines that were used in the B-29 bombers. And to do that, they built a massive plant in Chicago that was labeled as Dodge. Just one of the buildings there covered 82 acres and 30 city blocks. It was, in fact, enormous. And after the war, Preston Tucker made a deal for the building, or the whole, plant. There was multiple buildings there. And all of the Tucker cars were ultimately made there, which is 51. I can't imagine what he thought he would do with all that space, even if the Tucker had been a hit. Perhaps he wanted to make aircraft, as he'd previously submitted designs to the government for aircraft-related stuff. Now, after Tucker, Ford took over the huge Dodge plant, and as far as I can research, this was from 1951 to 1959. Ford built the 28-cylinder Pratt & Whitney engines and then the J-57 jets like they used for the B-52 bombers. Today, the Dodge Tucker Ford Mammoth facility is partially a mall and partially the source of Tootsie Rolls and Tootsie Pops. Back to Chrysler, the company built a variety of parts for the B-29 Superfortress, including the aluminum wing edges and engine cowling, but more important, the big deal was the manufacturing of the entire nose assemblies. Just look at these photos. So amazing. I think we've seen that so many of the Detroit OEs got together to do a bunch of stuff in World War II, but let's look at the list of automotive-related companies that worked just on the B-29. B.F. Goodrich, Briggs, which was a coach builder from the early 1900s, Chrysler's Air Temp division, which was for air conditioning, but they made other things for the B-29, and also DeSoto, Dodge, and Plymouth. Crosley made radar components. Firestone was involved. GM had Fisher Body, AC spark plugs that was also making things other than spark plugs, and Frigidaire made propellers. How weird is that? Frigidaire is another air conditioning company. Then there was Goodyear, Hudson, Indian Motorcycles, Kenworth Trucks, Murray Corporation, which was another coach builder. You might know Murray from having built some Ford Model A's. And then there's also Torrington. You know what a Torrington bearing is? Torrington's a bearing company. You still see them in automotive applications to this day. And now my favorite part of the video, because I dig the story of this guy, Robert Paxton McCulloch. As you'll see, he had his fingers in so much stuff, including some aircraft and engines that are seen at the Pima Museum. First thing, you should know that McCulloch married Barbara Ann Briggs, whose father was the Briggs of Briggs and Stratton. In 1937, McCulloch Engineering made centrifugal superchargers, usually for flathead Fords. They were sort of the pancake style, mounted horizontal on the top of a flathead, and he ultimately sold that company to Borg Warner. In the 50s, perhaps after a non-compete ended, I don't know, but he started Paxton Superchargers, and those were also centrifugals, but a little bit different design. He became an OE option on Fords, and here's Clark Gable in his Paxton-blown Thunderbird. In 1958, Paxton Automotive, or Paxton Superchargers, was sold to Andy Granatelli, who sold it to Studebaker. But the real money came from McCulloch Motors Corporation that started in 1943, and he was making two-stroke engines and other small engines, sort of in competition with Briggs & Stratton, which was his wife's family. And, of course, McCulloch made the first chainsaw in 1948, and I'm sure you've heard of McCulloch chainsaws. In 1956, he bought Scott Atwater Manufacturing and started selling outboard engines. And in the 50s and 60s, he made go-kart racing engines. And trust me, this is just the beginning of what this guy did in business. This is the wildest of all. He created Lake Havasu City, Arizona. He bought the land when it was all but bare, sometime between 1958 and 1963. Sources vary. And today it is a big destination for resort life. He started manufacturing his chainsaws there in 1964. And in 1967, he bought the London Bridge, like from London, England. The bridge built in 1831. They took it apart, labeled all the stones, shipped it across the Atlantic, rebuilt it in Lake Havasu, and it opened up in 1971, where it has stood ever since. He did this with a guy named C.V. Wood, who is in the middle of this pic with Walt Disney over on the left, because Wood was a developer for Disneyland. So all of this gives you an insight into the mind of this guy, Robert Paxton McCulloch. Really diverse, really kind of whack in some areas, but hugely successful in most areas. Now, he started the McCulloch Aircraft Corporation as a spin-off of the early Engine Corporation, and he made a bunch of stuff that is right here at the Pima Museum. Here's a McCulloch experimental two-stroke aircraft engine with an off-the-shelf Chrysler starter. That's like for a 440. And over here is one of his experimental diesel Radial engines. McCulloch made a bunch of engines for target drones for the military. He sold some to Radioplane, which is where Norma Jean Baker worked before she was Marilyn Monroe. This two-stroke could also be built as a 2- or 4-cylinder. This one's a 6. Sometime between 1949 and 1951, McCulloch absorbed the Helicopter Engineering Research Company out of Philadelphia because he loved choppers. In 1953, McCulloch built one of the company's designs, this twin rotor called the HUM-1, or the HUM-1, and it was a flop. They only made a couple of them. Finally, this is the McCulloch Super J2 gyrocopter of 1971 to 1973. Note that it is a pusher with a propeller in the back and an unpowered rotor at the top. The vision was that anyone could own an aircraft and fly it out of his own street because it had a really short takeoff distance. But the idea never took off. Sorry. And that's all I've got. Check out the Pima Air and Space Museum. It is pimaair.org. And when you go to any kind of aircraft museum, because they're absolutely everywhere in the United States, start thinking about all of the automotive stuff that was involved. If you're like me, it makes it much more interesting and entertaining, which is what I hope to be every single time on the David Freiburger channel. And I will see you next time.